I was 17 years old, and I did not know enough to be afraid of her. That is the truth of it, as plain as I can make it. People have asked me over the years what I was thinking when I knelt beside her in that crater, whether I was brave, whether I was foolish, whether there was some instinct at work that the older men on that field had long since had ground out of them. I tell them I don't know. I tell them I was cold and tired and the mud was halfway up my boots and she was bleeding, and she was making a sound I hadn't heard anything make before, and none of that seemed complicated to me. It seems complicated now. Then it was just the next thing that needed doing. My name is Ren Call. I was a stretcher bearer with the 7th Medical Corps during the closing weeks of the Arath engagement, which is what the histories call the 3-day killing in the Crossing Valley between the Allied lines and the eastern holdings of the Veth sovereignty. I was attached to a field surgeon named Orvith who was 61 years old and had seen 4 wars and had no patience for anything, and who, in 4 months of working beside him, taught me more about keeping a person alive than I could have learned in 10 years anywhere else. He had a habit of explaining what he was doing while he worked, not for the benefit of those watching, but because he believed that the act of explaining sharpened the thinking, and if someone else learned something from overhearing him, he considered that acceptable collateral. I learned more from that overhearing than from anything he said directly to me. But I want to be clear. I was a stretcher bearer. I carried. I fetched. I held the lamp and handed the instrument, and when the surgeon was finished, I carried again. The decisions were not mine. The expertise was not mine. I was 17 years old, and I had been doing the work for 4 months, and I was good at the physical parts of it. I was stronger than I looked, and I didn't drop anything. But I was not trained beyond the absolute basics, and I knew it. I carried a stretcher, and that is who I was on the field at Arath's crossing. The engagement ended on the morning of what the Corps called the 4th day, which was actually the morning of the 5th because someone on the command staff had miscounted. By the afternoon of that 5th day, the Armistice line had been set, a surveyor's stake every 40 meters across the valley floor, marked with signal cloth, and no crossing without parley and assigned runner's pass. The Allied lines held the valley's western and northern slopes. The sovereignty, which is what we called the territory and the governing body of the Veth both, when we needed a word for them, held the eastern slope and the lower ridgeline. And the valley floor between was for the dead and for the people tasked with moving the dead, which included me. We had been at it for 2 days. The valley floor was wide and the bodies were many, and the mud, after 3 days of artillery and 3 nights of rain, was a particular depth and consistency that made every step a deliberation. Your foot went in and the mud considered whether to give it back. Orvith's surgery tent was at the base of the western slope. I slept under the cart and ate what Missa brought me and tried not to dream. Missa was the Corps' other stretcher bearer. She was 20 and had been doing it for 2 years, and she had the kind of quiet competence that I tried to imitate and mostly failed at. She showed things rather than said them. How to lift from the legs and not the back. How to keep a stretcher level on uneven ground. How to speak to a patient who was too hurt to speak back. Taryn was the Corps quartermaster, who was 45 and walked with a permanent lean to the left from an old injury, and who called me kid, even after I had told him my name 3 times. He had a way of appearing exactly when something was about to go wrong, like a long-experienced weather sense for disaster, and he was never surprised by anything, which I found reassuring in ways I couldn't articulate. It was Taryn who sent me to the southeastern edge of the clearing zone on the afternoon of the 3rd day after the armistice. He needed a body count from that quarter, because the grave detail supervisor wanted numbers before nightfall, and the supervisor on the southeastern corner had gone missing, which turned out to be because he had stepped into a concealed drainage ditch and broken his ankle and was sitting in it waiting for someone to notice. But we didn't know that yet. So I went with my tally board and my lamp and my boots filling steadily with cold water, and I counted. The southeastern edge of the clearing zone ran to within 60 meters of the Armistice line. I could see the signal cloth stakes from where I worked, pale against the dark earth, and beyond them the eastern slope in its late afternoon haze. The slope was quiet. I had been told, in the briefings that the Corps attended, that the sovereignty's forces were well back from the Armistice line, and had been since the ceasefire was set, and that forward observers would be present but would not approach within 300 meters of the stakes. I thought about this while I counted bodies and wrote the numbers down, and tried to keep the tally board out of the mud. I thought about what it meant to agree to hold a line, and the quality of discipline required to hold it in the hours right after a fight when the impulse is to push. And I had some respect for it even at 17, even exhausted, even cold. I found her just before the light went. She was in a shell crater about 12 meters from the clearing zone's edge, which put her at roughly 50 meters from the nearest Armistice stake, which meant she was technically in the neutral zone, the no-man's land that the Armistice terms had designated for the purpose of recovering the dead without either side claiming the ground. She had come down into the crater from the eastern side, which I could tell from the tracks, and she had not come back up. I stood at the crater's rim for a moment before I understood what I was looking at. She was enormous. That is the first and clearest memory, the sheer size of her, which did not become real until I was standing above her, and even then kept reasserting itself, kept rewriting my sense of the crater's scale. She was dark copper from skull to tail tip, the color of old iron with a reddish undertone that caught the last of the daylight and held it longer than the surrounding mud, as if there was a warmth in the pigmentation itself. Her scales were not small and smooth like the illustrations in the field guides. They were large, overlapping, and at the neck and shoulders they ridged and thickened into something that looked structural, like buttressing on an old wall. The scales at her belly were smaller and paler, and she had a ridge of larger ones running the full length of her spine that caught the last low light and gave each one a separate shadow. Her wings were folded down against her flanks, and even folded they were enormous, the folded membrane visible as a darker mass against the mud, the leading edge where wing met shoulder heavy with a paired ridge of what looked like bone protrusions under the skin. Her tail was curled in the crater and still extended up the far wall. Her forelegs were braced into the ground and her head was down, and she was breathing in a way that I recognized immediately because I had heard it before on Orvith's table, the careful, controlled breathing of something in serious pain that has decided to manage the pain rather than respond to it. Short inhalation, slow exhalation, deliberate pause between. The breathing of an organism that is doing it on purpose rather than automatically, which is a thing you only do when automatic breathing has become inadequate to the situation. I looked at her for a moment, then I looked at the Armistice stakes, then I looked back at her. There was a wound in her left flank. I could see it from the crater rim, a dark split in the scales about 2 hands wide where something had gone through, artillery or a heavy bolt, and the wound had been partly sealed by clotted material but not fully, and around it the copper scales were darker with dried blood. She was bleeding slowly. She had been in the crater long enough that the mud around her was churned and settled, which meant she had been there since at least the day before, possibly the last day of the engagement itself. 2 days, possibly more, in a crater in the mud and the rain, with a wound in her flank and no one coming. She made the sound again. It was low and sustained and vibrated at a frequency that I felt in my chest rather than heard, and it was not a sound of anger. I had heard Orvith's patients make sounds in that register, low and controlled and very deliberate. The sound of someone holding something back that could not be given voice to safely. The sound of a body doing work it was not meant to do while trying not to fall apart. The sound underneath grief when grief has been going on long enough that even the grief is controlled. I climbed down into the crater. I did not make a decision to do it. I am aware that this sounds like I am diminishing the act or making it fate, but I mean it literally. There was no deliberation that I can reconstruct. She was in distress and I had a kit and I climbed down. The mud sucked at my boots on the slope, and I slid the last meter and caught myself on my hands and stood up, and she turned her head toward me, and I looked at her eyes. Her eyes were amber, not the gold I had expected from the illustrations, but a deep warm amber with a pupil that was currently contracted to a vertical slit, and focused on me with a precision that I understood was not animal. There was something in the focus, a quality of attention, of assessment, that I had no name for at 17 beyond the simple recognition that whatever was happening behind those eyes was more than reflex. She was close enough that I could see the individual scales around her eye socket, each one edged with a darker line, the fine detail of them like the grain in old wood, where you can see that the tree lived a long time. Her breath came past my face in a warm current, and it smelled of smoke and metal, and something faintly medicinal that I couldn't identify. And it was warm in the way of something much larger than me, the warmth of a body that generates more heat than mine simply by virtue of scale. She looked at me for a long time, and I looked at her, and neither of us moved. Then she dropped her head back to the mud, slowly, deliberately, with the specific deliberateness of a creature making a choice rather than surrendering to exhaustion. And the sound came again, lower than before. That was when I understood. I had been looking at the wound in her flank, which was serious but stable. I had not been looking further back. When she shifted her weight, I saw the real situation, and the real situation was that she was in labor. I stood there for a moment. I want to be honest about this. I stood there for a moment, and the first coherent thought I had was that I needed Orvith. The second was that I could not get Orvith here in time, and that even if I ran both ways, the round trip was 30 minutes, and the situation in this crater was not a 30-minute situation. The third thought was that my kit contained certain things that might be useful, and that the alternative to using them was to climb back out of this crater and leave her here, and that I was not going to do that. I had assisted at 2 human births during my time with the Corps, both of them emergency situations where Orvith had handed me things, and told me what to do with a speed that suggested he expected me to keep up, and I had kept up. I had assisted once at the delivery of a lamb on a farm I had worked on at 14 breech presentation, the farmer's hands too large for the work, and the farmer had talked me through it with the same rapid-fire calm that Orvith used, and I had done it. I had no training beyond these 2 experiences and my own 2 hands and a field kit, but the principle, it seemed to me, was the principle. The body needed help, and I had hands and I had the kit. I opened the kit. The first thing I did was the wound. I could not fix it, not truly, not the depth of it, but I could pack it better than it was packed, and Orvith had taught me how to pack a wound so that it held through the night, using what you had, building pressure and keeping the seal. She was still when I reached for the wound, and I spoke to her the way Orvith spoke to patients, quietly and without urgency, describing what I was doing as I did it. I do not know if she understood the words. I believed then and believe now that she understood the tone. The tone said, "I know what I'm touching, I'm being careful." It said, "I'm not going to stop until it's done." She stayed still. I used half my field dressings and all of my packing material, and I tied the whole thing off with the surgical cord, which ran out before I was quite done, and then I used a strip of blanket for the last of it. When I was finished, I sat back on my heels and looked at her flank, and it was not good work. It was the work of a 17-year-old with basic field training and no proper materials. But it was better than what had been there, and sometimes better is all you have. Then I moved further back and addressed the labor, which was not going well. I will not describe it in full. There were 4 eggs. I learned this later from the sovereignty envoy, who told me things I hadn't known and a few things I hadn't thought to ask, and they came over the course of most of that night, and they did not all come easily. The first came while I was still finishing the wound work, without my assistance. I was aware of it only peripherally, the shift in her body, the cessation of a particular tension that had been building since I arrived. I checked it, dark, speckled, warm, tucked against her flank. Alive, as best I could tell, though I had no way to know what a dragon's egg was supposed to feel like, and was relying on what living felt like in the abstract, which is warmer than not living and denser and present in a way that I cannot describe more precisely than that. The second came wrong and I had to reach in and correct the angle, which was something I had done once before with a breech lamb, and the knowledge was not the same but the principle was close enough. She made a sound during that, a high, sustained, very quiet sound that I felt in my back teeth, and I spoke to her the whole time, steady and low, describing each thing before I did it. After, I leaned against the crater wall for a minute and looked at my hands, which were shaking, and then I stopped looking at them. The third came easily, late in the night, when I was at the lowest point of cold and exhaustion, and had been sitting against the wall with my knees up and my eyes open for so long that the crater had taken on a quality of permanence, as if it had always been here and I had always been in it. I caught myself thinking of ordinary things, a meal I had eaten 3 weeks before, a conversation with Missa about the proper way to tie a field knot, the smell of the bakery in the provincial town where I had grown up, the way the mind fills silence with the nearest available material. Then her breathing changed and I moved. At some point in the dark hours I lit the lantern. I was aware that the lantern would be visible from the slope and from the Armistice line, and I lit it anyway because I needed the light. The oil was limited and I rationed it, cupping my hand around the flame when I wasn't actively using it to see, letting the crater go dark between the moments of work. The dark was not absolute. There was enough cloud-reflected light from the direction of the Allied camp to see the broad outlines of things. But for the close work, for the checking and the packing and the reading of her breathing, I needed the lantern. I was also aware, by that point, that there was something on the eastern ridge that was watching. I had noticed it gradually, the way you notice a shape in the dark that slowly resolves into something you have to account for. At first I thought it was the ridgeline itself, or a trick of the lantern's light on the fog. Then I looked more carefully. The shapes on the ridge were not stationary. They were very nearly stationary, but not quite. There was a slowness of movement, the way a waiting person shifts their weight without meaning to, the minor sway of a standing body. And there were more of them than there should have been for a ridgeline, and they were arranged with a regularity that was not geological, evenly spaced, present across a length of ridge that I, even in the lamplight, could not see the full extent of. I looked at them for a while. The fog thickened and thinned in the way of valley fog at night, and in the thinning moments I could see a little more clearly. Large shapes, most of them with wings at rest, but a few with wings slightly raised in a way that I associated from the field guides with the sovereignty's formal standing posture. Their eyes, and I could see their eyes, even at that distance, which should not have been possible until I remembered that the field guides said their night vision worked differently than mine. Their eyes were on the crater. On her, on me. I looked at them for a while, then I looked at her. Then I went back to what I was doing. I don't know exactly what I thought in that moment. I think I thought, they can see what I'm doing. I think I thought, then let them see it. I was not brave. I was not calculating. I was mostly very tired and very cold and focused on the work immediately in front of me. And whatever was on the ridge was very still and very far away. And she was right here and needed help. And the only thing that mattered in that crater was the next thing that needed doing. The fourth egg came at what I judged to be about an hour before dawn. It was the hardest. The labor had been long and she was tiring, and what should have been straightforward took longer than it should, and I used the last of my surgical cord and both remaining field dressings and the rest of the blanket in ways that Orvith would have had comments about. And I spoke to her for almost the full duration without stopping, not because I thought she needed the words, but because I needed something to keep my own hands steady. By the time it was done, I was sitting back in the mud with my arms around my knees and my chin down, and breathing carefully through my own particular version of the careful management breathing. She was quiet for a long time after. I watched her and she was quiet. And then she exhaled a long, slow breath that was different from all the breaths before it, less controlled, more released. and she lifted her head and looked at the 4 eggs tucked against her flank and her expression, which I was by then beginning to be able to read in the smallest ways, was not triumph and not relief, but something simpler and older than both. She looked at me then. I looked back. In the lamplight her eyes were the color of late afternoon sun on old brass, and the pupil had widened in the dark to something rounder, less predatory, and she looked at me for a long time without any of the assessment or the measurement of the first look. This was a different kind of looking. I did not have words for it at 17. I am not sure I have words for it now. It was the looking of a creature that has been in the dark with you through a long and difficult night, and has arrived at the other side of it, and is marking that you were there. I put my hand on her jaw the way I had been resting it off and on while she breathed, just briefly. Then I sat back and watched the eggs and let her sleep. Just before full light, Taryn found me. I heard him at the crater rim before I saw him, the particular quality of silence that precedes a person who is about to say something very loud being suppressed into something very quiet. Then his head appeared over the rim, and he looked down at me, and at her, and at the eggs, and at the ridge, and he was quiet for a long time. "Kid," he said finally. "Taryn, what in the name of every hollow god are you doing?" "She was in labor," I said. "The wound was blocking the passage. I corrected it." Another silence. "You corrected it," he said. "Second egg came wrong. I had to redirect." Taryn looked at the eggs. He looked at her. He looked at the ridge, which I watched him notice. I saw the moment he saw the shapes on it, and the way the color shifted in his face, and the very careful, very controlled way he did not react to it. He was a man who had seen a lot of things and was not easily unsettled, and the ridge unsettled him. "Missa's with me," he said. "We've been looking for you since first light." "I'm here." "I can see that." He was quiet for another moment. "How many on the ridge?" It wasn't really a question. He could see it as well as I could. "I don't know exactly," I said. "More than I could count in the dark." "They haven't moved." "All night, not toward the line." He absorbed this. Is the dragon going to make it? I thought about the wound and the blood loss and the night of labor, and the fact that she was still breathing steadily, and her color had not changed in the way that color changes when something is losing the fight. "I think so," I said. "If the wound holds and she's somewhere warm by midday." "She's 50 meters from the Armistice line." "Yes." "They can't come get her." "Not without crossing." Taryn looked at the ridge again. I watched him think through what he was looking at, the shapes, the stillness, the controlled distance. He was a man who understood discipline and what it cost, and I could see him understanding it now. "All right," he said. "Come up, leave your kit." "I should." "Ren." His voice was not loud, but it had a particular quality that Orvith's also had, the quality of having said a thing once and meaning it completely. "Come up, now." I looked at her. She was watching me with one amber eye, the pupil expanded now in the pre-dawn gray, and her expression, the small adjustments that I had learned over the night to read in the scales around her eye socket, was not afraid. She knew I was leaving. I don't know how I knew that she knew, except that the awareness was mutual in the way that awareness between two beings in a small space for a long night tends to become mutual. She knew, and she was not afraid, and there was in that something that required no translation. I put my hand briefly on her jaw, then I climbed up out of the crater. Missa was at the top, and she looked at me without saying anything, and then she looked at Taryn, and then they walked me back to the surgery tent without a word. My hands had stopped shaking somewhere around the third egg. The cold had gone from miserable to something past miserable that had its own quality of simplicity, the way extreme cold eventually simplifies everything. I walked and I did not feel my feet very well, and the valley was coming up gray with dawn, and the signal cloth stakes were pale lines in the early light. I was aware, the whole walk back, of the ridge at my back and the stillness on it, and the enormous quiet of something large holding itself in place. What I expected when I got back to the tent was trouble. I had entered the neutral zone without authorization. I had interfered with what the Armistice terms called a sovereignty subject. I had been missing for a full night without reporting in, and the grave detail supervisor was still in his drainage ditch waiting for rescue. Any of those things, individually, was a problem. All of them together was a substantial problem. Orvith looked at me for a long time. Long enough that I stopped trying to read his face, because there was too much in it, too many layers of response being sorted and considered and set aside. He had the expressions of a man who had assembled a verdict, and then reconsidered it several times and not yet reached a conclusion. "Tell me what you did," he said. I told him. All of it, the wound packing, the labor, the angles, the cord, the strip of blanket for the last of it, the water from the canteen, the ridge. I told it the way Orvith had taught me to give a patient report, which is in order and without editorializing, just the sequence of events and what you found at each step. He listened without interrupting, which was not his habit. When I had finished, he was quiet for a while. "You corrected a breech presentation," he said, "on a species you have no training in a crater in the dark." I had the lantern. "Don't be clever." But his voice saying it was not sharp the way it usually was. "The cord and the packing, you used the field surgeon's knot." "Yes. For the whole thing. Where I had cord, the end is blanket strip." He nodded slowly, with the expression of a man reviewing work he has not personally checked but has some confidence in the technique of. He asked me 3 more questions about the wound packing, the placement, the pressure, the knot structure, and I answered them as precisely as I could, and he nodded at each answer in a way that told me the answer was correct without saying so directly. "The eggs are alive," he said finally. "When I left, and she was stable. Breathing well, wound was holding." He nodded again. He looked at the tent wall for a while, which was what he did when he was deciding something. "You know that going into the neutral zone without a runner's pass is a 3-day confinement," he said. "Yes." "And you know that interfering with sovereignty persons or property in the Armistice zone is a court-martial offense." "She wasn't a person or property," I said. "She was dying in a ditch." Orvith looked at me. He had pale eyes, washed-out gray, and they had seen 4 wars and most of what those wars contained, and they looked at me now with an expression that I could not quite read, something between the look he gave competent work and the look he gave me when I said something that was technically wrong but directionally right. "Yes," he said, "she was." He sent the runner's report to command himself, which was the part that kept it from being a court-martial, and made it a reprimand instead. The reprimand noted that a field carer under his supervision had entered the neutral zone without authorization and interfered with a sovereignty subject. And that said field carer had been corrected and was unlikely to repeat the behavior. Orvith wrote that last part with a very flat expression, and when I started to say something he held up one hand, and I stopped. The confinement was 3 days. I spent most of it sleeping, and when I wasn't sleeping I lay under the cart looking at the underside of it and listening to the valley sounds, the work crews on the floor, the distant calls of the grave detail, the wind coming down through the passes, and thinking about nothing in particular with the comfortable vacancy of a body that has been pushed close to its edge and is now recovering. Missa brought me food. Taryn came once and sat at the end of my cart without speaking for about 20 minutes and then left, which was his version of checking in. Orvith did not come, which was also his version of something, though I wasn't sure what. On the 2nd day of my confinement, Missa came to the cart and sat beside it and told me that the Sovereignty's forward observers had sent a runner to our command post. The runner had not carried a message, just a token, a small disc of dark copper metal about the size of a large coin, which the runner had set on the command post's table and departed without speaking. No one had known what it meant. The command staff had argued about whether it was a threat. Orvith had looked at it and said it wasn't, and when they asked him how he knew, he had said, "Because a threat doesn't look like that," which had not fully satisfied the staff but which had halted the argument. "He showed it to me," Missa said. She held it out, I took it. It was plain on one side, and on the other had been marked with a single symbol in fine incised lines, something like a stylized sun, or a wheel, or perhaps a dragon's eye seen from directly above. The lines were very precise and very deep, as if they had been cut rather than stamped. The disc was warm in a way that metal doesn't stay warm after being handled and set down, as if it had been heated recently or as if the warmth was coming from within it, which it couldn't be. But that was how it felt. "Orvith says it's a founding house seal," Missa said. "He says the sovereignty uses it on formal record communications." I looked at the symbol. I thought about the ridge and 300 shapes in the fog. "Is she alive?" I said. "Orvith sent a query through Parley this morning. The sovereignty responded in 4 minutes. She paused. 4 minutes, Wren, for a formal Parley query. They'd had the response ready. "What did it say?" "She lives. The clutch is whole." Missa looked at me steadily. "Clutch whole," Orvith says in their treaty language. That phrase means the succession is intact, not just the eggs alive, the lineage. Whatever those 4 eggs are, whoever they are, they're significant in a way that goes beyond the individuals. I thought about the second egg, and the angle in my hands in the dark. "How significant?" I said. Missa was quiet for a moment. She had dark eyes and a direct way of looking that did not soften things and did not dramatize them either. She gave you information and let you do what you needed to with it. "I don't know exactly," she said. "Neither does Orvith, but he says the founding house seal hasn't appeared on a communication in 60 years. It goes on permanent archive materials, the kind that get read 100 years from now." She looked at the disc in my hands. "He thinks it means you're in the record." I turned the disc over. The plain side caught the light. "You really didn't know, did you," Missa said, "what she was?" "I knew she was in trouble." "That's not what I meant." She reached over and tapped the disc lightly. "Orvith says the particular seal on this disc belongs to the sovereignty's founding house, the direct bloodline. He says in 60 years it's only been used for births, deaths, and succession changes." I looked at her, she looked at me. "You corrected the angle on the succession of the Veth sovereignty," Missa said, very quietly. "In a crater, in the dark, with a roll of surgical cord and the blanket you carry for cold patients." I did not know what to say to that. "I thought she needed help," I said. Missa was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "she did," and she stood up and left. I held the disc until it cooled, and then I put it in my kit because I didn't know what else to do with it. And then I lay back under the cart and looked at the boards above me and thought about what it meant to do a thing without knowing what it was, and whether the not knowing changed the thing itself. And I did not arrive at any conclusions, but the thinking was not unpleasant. The envoy came on the 18th day after the Armistice. By then I had served my 3 days of confinement and been back at the clearing work for 2 weeks, and we had, between us, cleared most of the valley floor. The grave detail was finishing its last sections. Orvith was preparing the corps to move north to the next station. I was packing the supply cart when Taryn came to find me. He walked with his usual lean and his usual economical expression, and he said, "Someone to see you, at the command post." "What kind of someone?" "The sovereignty kind," he said, and walked away. I set down the crate I was holding and looked at my hands for a moment. They were dirty from the packing, and there was nothing to do about that. I wiped them on my trousers and walked up to the command post. The command post at Arath's Crossing was a tent, same as everything else, larger than most, with a floor of wooden boards and a table and 4 field chairs, and a communications array in the corner that Orvith had commandeered for medical relay, and the command staff had never entirely forgiven him for. When I pushed aside the tent flap, there were 3 people inside. Commander Selva, who ran our section of the Corps and was a compact woman of 55 who had no capacity for pretense, her aide, whose name I always forgot, and a figure that was not, technically, a person in the sense I had been raised to understand the word. The sovereignty envoy was a scaled humanoid hybrid. That was the term in the field guides, which I had been issued and which I had read twice, but which had not quite prepared me for the actual experience. He stood about 7 feet tall, and his scales were the deep amber bronze of old varnish, and his eyes were the same amber as hers had been, and his hands, which he held clasped in front of him at a level that suggested deliberate formality, had an extra joint at the second knuckle and ended in narrow, tapered shapes that were not quite fingernails and not quite claws. He wore no armor. He wore draped cloth in the sovereignty's colors, which are deep copper and ash gray, and around his neck he wore a chain from which hung a larger version of the disc Missa had brought me. He looked at me when I came in. The amber eyes moved to me and settled, and the clarity of that attention, the way it was complete and total, not scanning, not assessing, just fully present, was something I had seen before. I had felt it in a crater in the dark and cold 18 days ago, and I recognized it now. Selva said, "Stretcher-bearer call. The sovereign's voice has requested a formal audience." I had not known what sovereign's voice meant. I had not had time to learn. I stood in the entrance of the tent in my dirty work clothes with my dirty hands, and I said, "Yes, Commander." The envoy spoke then, and he spoke in our language, which I had not expected, a clear, considered version of it that had no accent I could name, as if it had been learned from records rather than from people. "I am Veth Sorin," he said. "I speak for the sovereignty in formal record. I will speak plainly, because the sovereignty believes that what was done in the neutral zone 18 days ago deserves plain speech and not ceremony." I waited. "The one you aided," he said, "is Veth Kara. She is the sovereignty's first mother. The term does not translate precisely, but she is the one from whom the present sovereignty's bloodline descends in the primary line. She is very old. She went to the neutral zone on the engagement's last day to recover a young one who had gone down in the valley, a soldier of the sovereignty, her nephew's son, who was already dead when she found him, and she was struck by artillery on her return. She could not reach her own line without triggering a ceasefire violation, because she had crossed during the fighting, and the armistice was set while she was across. She was trapped in the neutral zone. I thought about the tracks in the mud, coming from the eastern side. The clutch was not expected," he continued. "The sovereignty's healers believe the labor was triggered by the trauma of the wound, an emergency response, in terms of her physiology. A body deciding that waiting was no longer viable. The eggs were not due for another 2 months by our reckoning. She was alone and wounded and in labor on the wrong side of the armistice line, and there was nothing the sovereignty could do." He paused. "To cross the armistice line without authorization would have ended the ceasefire. The terms we had agreed to were explicit, and the sovereignty had agreed to them in good faith. The sovereignty chose to hold the line." He said it simply, without emphasis or self-congratulation, the way you state a fact about something difficult that has been survived. "It was," he added after a moment, "the most difficult decision the sovereignty has made in my lifetime. I thought about the shapes on the ridge and the 300 and the stillness of them. I thought about what it looked like from the ridge, down into the crater, her in the mud, the lantern, my hands. I thought about how long 300 people can hold themselves still when everything in them wants to move." "They watched all night," I said. "Yes." "How many?" Veth Sorin looked at me for a moment. "The sovereign himself, 11 of the great houses, their assembled families and households, the sovereignty's healing corps positioned at the line and unable to cross, approximately 300. I thought about that number. 300 in the fog and the dark, watching a 17-year-old with a field kit work in the bottom of a shell crater. 300 holding themselves back from what they needed to do most. 300 who had agreed to hold a line and held it through what must have been the longest night of their lives, because it was the right thing, because they had agreed, because she was still alive and crossing would end that. "You are very young," Veth Soren said, with a tone that was not dismissive, the tone of a person stating a fact that is relevant without being limiting. "The sovereignty wishes to understand why you went into the crater." I thought about it. Not long, the answer had always been the same. I just hadn't needed to say it aloud before. "She was in trouble," I said, "and I had things in my kit." Veth Soren was quiet for a moment. His expression, the adjustment of scales around his eyes and jaw, the slight tension and release, shifted into something that I recognized now as the deliberate stillness. The stillness of a person who has received the answer they expected and is still, somehow, struck by hearing it said plainly. "The sovereignty wishes to make a formal record of acknowledgement," he said, "in the permanent archive of the Veth Founding House, which is the archive in which the sovereignty records matters of generational significance. Your name, Ren Call, and your action will be entered in this archive with the notation that you kept company with Veth Kara in the neutral zone of Arath's crossing through the night of the 18th day of the Armistice, and that by your action the clutch of four was preserved, and that the succession is whole." I did not say anything. "Additionally," he said, "the sovereignty extends to you the naming honor Keth Salen. It is not a title in your language's sense. It does not convey rank or command or obligation. It is a name in the sovereignty's naming tradition that records the nature of a bond between people. Keth Salen means approximately the one who stayed when no one asked." A brief pause. "It is a name that Veth Kara chose herself, which is her right. The sovereignty does not override the naming choices of the First Mother." Commander Selva, who had not moved or spoken since I came in, said quietly, "Call." "Commander, you are being offered something that very few people outside the sovereignty have received. You're allowed to respond." I looked at Veth Soren. His amber eyes were on me with that full, unscannable attention. "Is she well?" I said. Another of those brief adjustments in his expression, the stillness coming and then resolving. "She heals slowly," he said. "The wound was serious and her age does not help it, but she heats in the sun, which is what she does when she is healing, and she has eaten, which is what she does when she intends to continue. The healers say she is difficult to assist because she insists on directing them, which they consider a good sign." A brief hesitation. "It is a good sign." "And the hatchlings?" Something changed in his face. The formal, deliberate stillness shifted into something warmer and less controlled, the way the stillness of a formal occasion shifts when the occasion permits a moment of the actual. "They are loud and demanding and entirely well," he said. "The fourth one, the one that required the correction in the night, is particularly demanding, which the healers describe as vigorous and Veth Kara describes as expected." A pause, and then he said something I had not anticipated. "She says to tell you that she will remember the sound of your voice in the dark." I stood there in the tent for a moment and tried to think of something to say that was adequate to that. I thought about the crater and the lantern and the long hours of talking into the dark, describing each thing as I did it, keeping my voice steady so that my hands would follow. I thought about what it had felt like to do that, the way the speaking had served the doing, the way the obligation to keep going had held both things together. I thought about what she had been holding at her end, the pain, the labor, the long night, the ridge behind her where 300 of her people waited without crossing. I could not find words that were adequate to it. "Thank you," I said. Veth Soren inclined his head, a slow, formal gesture, the kind that carries weight by virtue of its deliberateness. "The sovereignty thanks you," he said. "The sovereignty will not forget Ren Call." Then Selva's aide was opening the tent flap, and he walked out, and I stood in the middle of the command post with my dirty hands, and I heard Selva exhale slowly behind me. "Go back to your cart, Call," she said. Her voice was carefully level. "We're moving north in the morning." "Yes, Commander." "And Call." "Commander." Wash your hands first. We moved north the next morning, and I packed the cart and ran the stretchers in 2 more engagements and 3 more clearing operations, and helped Orvith with 17 surgeries and 2 field births, and 1 triage situation that I still think about sometimes when I am working on something difficult, and the answer isn't coming. I was with the 7th Medical Corps for 8 more months, until my enlistment ended, and I was mustered out at the provincial station with a small pay packet, and the reprimand still on my service record, the language of which I had read carefully and which said, in Orvith's handwriting, that I had entered the neutral zone without authorization and interfered with a sovereignty subject, and was unlikely to repeat the behavior. I have always been fond of that sentence. Orvith shook my hand when I left, which was the first time he had ever shaken my hand, and he said, "You have good instincts. Don't let anyone convince you that's not a skill." I said, "Thank you," he said. "The surgical cord. Next time you correct a breach, use 2 loops at the anchor point, not 1. I said I would. He said, "Good, go on then." And I went on. I trained as a medic in the 2 years after the Corps, civilian side, at the Veth Crossing facility, which was the closest town with a proper training program. It was a good program and I was a good student, and at the end of it, I had credentials that Orvith would have considered minimal but adequate, and I set up a practice in the lower valley and worked it for the next several decades, and the work was good and I was glad to be doing it. In my 3rd year of practice, I received a letter. It came by Sovereignty Courier, which I knew because Sovereignty Courier envelopes are the copper gray of their colors and carry a seal on the back that I had seen before. I opened it at my kitchen table before my morning shift. The letter was written in formal sovereignty notation, which I could mostly read by then because my training program had included a treaty language course. It was brief. It said, "The 4th of the Clutch of 4 has been named. The sovereignty records this, as it records all hatchling namings of the founding house, in the permanent archive. The 4th is named Veth Ren, in the sovereignty's tradition of honoring those who shaped a life's beginning. The sovereignty considered that you should know this." Below the formal notation, in a different hand larger, with a quality that suggested the writer was not accustomed to the pen's size, or perhaps was working carefully with something other than hands as they are usually understood, were 3 words in our language. "She is loud." I sat at my kitchen table with the letter for a while. Outside the window the morning was clear and the valley was green, and the light was doing what light does in the lower valley in early summer, which is everything it can. I thought about a crater in the mud and an amber eye in the lantern light. I thought about the ridge and the stillness and 300 shapes holding themselves back from the thing they needed to do most, because what was in the crater needed something other than what they could give. I thought about the kind of love that requires that holds itself still through the longest night, not because it doesn't feel the urgency, but because the urgency is not the point. I thought about a 17-year-old with a field kit, and a roll of surgical cord and no particular plan beyond the next thing that needed doing. I folded the letter and put it in the box where I keep the things I do not want to lose. The copper disc was already there, which I had carried since Missa gave it back to me, and had moved from kit to coat pocket to box in the years between. I put the letter beside it and closed the box. Then I got up and washed my hands and went to work. I have been asked, many times in the years since, whether I regret the reprimand on my service record, or the 3 days of confinement, or the risk of the court-martial. People ask it as if these are clearly bad things that a reasonable person would have avoided if they had known better, and I understand why they ask it, and I try to answer honestly, which means I tell them that the only thing I was sorry for in the crater was that my surgical cord ran out before I was done. I tell them that I have thought about it many times since and that I should always carry more surgical cord. People find this unsatisfying. I understand that too. The honest answer is rarely the one people are hopping for. What I know is this. There was a crater in the neutral zone of Arath's Crossing, and there was a wounded creature in it who was also something far older and stranger and more important than I had any way of knowing at the time, and she was in trouble and I had things in my kit. Everything else, the archive, the nomming, the letter with 3 words in a hand not meant for pens, the small fourth hatchling with her demanding loud voice, and a name that starts with mine, all of that came after. And it is real and it matters and I am glad of every piece of it, but it came after. It was not why I climbed down. I climbed down because she was in trouble and I had things in my kit. That is the whole of it. I would climb down again. The last time I went back to Areth's Crossing was 12 years after the Armistice, when I was 29 and the valley had been resettled, and the clearing ground was farmland, and the Armistice stakes had long since been pulled up, and the old survey lines were field boundaries now. The shell craters were mostly filled in. You could see where they had been. A slight depression, a particular shade of new grass that grew in the disturbed ground, and the southeastern edge of the valley was grazing land for 3 farms. I found the crater by packing the distance from the tree line, because I had counted my steps the afternoon Taryn sent me out for the body count, and I had never lost those numbers, the way you never lose the numbers that were the measure of something. The crater was shallower than I remembered, which is what happens to them over years as the earth settles, and grass had grown over it evenly, and in the bottom of it there was a stone. The stone was not local. It was a darker color than the valley's rock, and it had been worked, its edges squared and its face smoothed. On its face was a single symbol in incised lines, the stylized sun or wheel or dragon's eye, the founding house seal. No words in any language, ours or theirs. Nothing that announced itself or named what it was marking. Just the seal and the stone and the grass growing up around it. Someone had known where to put it. Someone had counted their own paces, or something like counting paces, and had come back when the valley was green and safe again, and had placed the stone and left without ceremony. I sat on the grass beside it for a while. The valley was full of summer sound, insects, wind, somewhere further along a farm dog doing its rounds, the distant call of someone working in the fields. The sky was the particular deep blue of the lower valley in midsummer, the kind that seems too saturated to be real and is real anyway. I thought about a loud hatchling somewhere far to the east, 12 years old now by human reckoning and older in ways I didn't have the vocabulary for, carrying a name that started with Veth and ended with mine. I put my hand on the stone. It was warm from the sun. "She is loud," I said, to no one in particular and to everything that had been watching. Then I stood up and walked back to the road. That is all I have to say about it. A crater in the mud, a field kit, a roll of surgical cord that ran out too soon and 2 strips of blanket that held what the cord couldn't. The rest is what followed, and what followed was more than anything a 17-year-old stretcher-bearer working his way across a clearing ground had any right to expect from his life. I still carry more surgical cord than I need. I always will.